Chapter 6. Toad explores his childhood. Toad found the days following that last meeting strange and unsettling. He found himself remembering long-forgotten incidents of his childhood. Well-remembered events were rehearsed over and over in his mind, and memories of his parents and also of his grandparents were never far away. He went up to the attic and found an old album of sepia-tinted family photographs. These evoked a great sadness in him, not so much because the people in it were no longer alive, but because he featured in so few of them. He remembered his stern, demanding father, who always gave Toad the impression that he, Toad, did not come up to his high standards, and, what's more, never would. He remembered a world inhabited by big, successful men, all of whom, it seemed to Toad, had achieved great things in their different spheres. His paternal grandfather had started the family brewing company, followed by his father when, in turn, he became head of the family. Toad remembered being taken around the brewery as a child and being frightened by the noise and the steam and the smell. He knew then that he would be expected to work in that horrid place, and yet even then he realized that he never could. He remembered his mother, a quiet person who was dominated by her husband, as she had been dominated by her father. He had been an eminent cleric, and eventually a suffragan bishop. Henceforth he was always referred to as the bishop, even by his daughter. Toad remembered a tall person with an imposing presence and large pectoral cross, who always said in a tone of delighted surprise, "Ah, little cakes," when tea was served. He remembered that at times his mother could be full of fun, yet Toad felt that she was always conscious of her husband's appraisal and constantly checking for signs of his disapproval. As a result, she would often withdraw her affection from Toad in order to avoid her husband's displeasure and conform to his stricter views. He remembered very few cuddles. As the day of the next counselling session drew near, Toad felt a mixture of emotions which he had not experienced before. His main feeling was sadness and depression, remembering as he did an unhappy and lonely childhood, where there was not a great deal of love or happiness. But even so he could recall people rather like bit players, who had made brief entrances into his life, and who unwittingly delineated behaviours and aroused emotions which indicated the otherness of things. This happened mainly at Christmas time, when a variety of people paid their annual respects and brought presents and hoped to receive dark bottles brought up from the brewery cellars. He remembered an aged aunt with a large black hat secured by enormous hat-pins, which he assumed must be stuck right through her head. Then there was a large jolly person who did conjuring tricks and once, when alone with Toad, and to his great amazement lit his farts. And there was an aged uncle, with a gold watch chain hung across a large stomach, who gave Toad a sovereign and squeezed his thigh in a very horrid way. And underlying all these memories, which came unbidden into Toad's mind, there was growing a strong yet impotent anger. Impotent because he wasn't sure who he was angry with, or what he was angry about. The result was that he began to feel guilty about feeling angry, for he knew in his heart of hearts, although he would probably not tell this even to Heron, that he was extremely angry with his parents. This anger, however, presented him with problems, which he was finding difficult to resolve. Presumably his parents had done their best for him when he was a child, and here he was now, in a beautiful house which he had inherited from them. They had also made sure he was more than adequately provided for. To make it even more difficult, both his parents had been dead for some time, so just as Toad had found it difficult to be angry with them when they were alive, he found it totally impossible now that they were dead. But the angry feelings would not go away. Consequently, it was a very emotional Toad who rang the doorbell of the heronry and took his accustomed seat in the study. "Good morning, Toad," said Heron. "How has your week been?" "I am not too sure," Toad answered quietly. "I am frightened that I am beginning to feel depressed again. That worries me because I thought I was feeling better." "What do you think has made you feel like this?" asked Heron. "I think it's because of the homework you asked me to do," Toad replied. "I have found it very painful to recall parts of my childhood, and that is why I am feeling sad." And Toad, for the first time in some while, burst into tears. Heron passed the box of tissues, and Toad took one and wiped his eyes. Then he took another and blew his nose vigorously. After a pause, Heron asked him if he was feeling better. "Yes," said Toad. "Surprisingly, I do." "You see," said Heron, "there is a real and discernible reason for your current sadness. You recalled unhappy times, and you responded quite naturally by feeling sad and unhappy, and so you cried. Can you accept that explanation?" "I suppose so," said Toad, sniffing, "but I don't like blubbing like that." "I'm sure you don't," said Heron. "But if you want to understand more about yourself, you need to get in touch with your feelings and understand them. Otherwise, you deny them either by ignoring or suppressing them. The result can be rather like an amputation. A vital part of you is severed, and effectively you are disabled, to a greater or lesser extent." "So it's all right to cry?" asked Toad. "I remember Father being very strict about it. If I cried, he used to say, 'Now stop that blubbing at once, or I shall be extremely angry.' So of course I would stop." "You have the choice," said Heron very seriously. "Will you obey the voice of your dead father, or will you give yourself permission and take your own authority?" "That seems a very stark way of putting things," said Toad, looking uncomfortable. "After all, I'm only wondering about crying or not. It seems overly dramatic to talk about the voice of my dead father, don't you think?" "It may well be," answered Heron, "but we are working on dramatic events. From your simple question flow many important issues that can have a profound effect on your learning, and therefore on the rest of your life." Toad had by now become extremely attentive. His tears had dried up, and he was alert and actively listening. "Go on then, Heron," he said. "I'm listening." "Good," responded Heron. "In that case, I shall take up my teaching role again in order to provide you with more insight into yourself. Do you remember our discussion about the child ego state, made up of the natural and the adapted child?" "I certainly do," said Toad. "It has had a profound effect on me, and I'd hoped we were going to talk more about it today. I am ready for it." "I believe you are," said Heron. "So here goes. Toad, who were the most influential people in your childhood?" "That's easy," replied Toad. "My mother and father, of course, and in the background my grandparents." "Let us concentrate on your parents first. What sort of a person was your father?" Toad answered unhesitatingly. "Stern and upright. I remember him always telling me off about something or other. He would look at me in a very disapproving way and say, 'Theophilus, how many times have I got to tell you? Don't do that.' He was always reproving and criticizing me. Gradually I grew up to accept that he was always right and I was always wrong, so it seemed logical that he should tell me off." "Would he ever hit you?" asked Heron. "Oh, no," answered Toad. "There was no need for that. One look from father was enough, and he would stop being affectionate towards me. Not that he was ever very affectionate. His most severe punishment was to say in an icy voice, 'Go to your room and don't come down until you're ready to apologize.' I can remember a few occasions where he played with me, but they always ended badly. Perhaps because I was so desperate to be loved by him, I would get silly and do something foolish. I can remember once when this happened. He pushed me off his knee and said to Mother, 'I can't stand it when he behaves like this,' and walked out of the room. I just burst into tears." After a pause during which Toad's eyes were bright with unshed tears, Heron asked, "And what of your mother?" "She was very much under the thumb of Father, but I always felt closer to her than to him. She would occasionally cuddle me, but not much. If I came running to her when Father had been horrid, she would say, 'Now don't be silly, dear, I'm sure he didn't mean it.' Because I was her only child, I think she found it difficult to treat me other than as a baby. She embarrassed me terribly at school when she visited me on sports day and would insist on calling me dear little Theo in front of the other boys and tried to comb my hair." "And did things improve as you grew up?" asked Heron. "Oh, no, not at all," answered Toad. "For instance, when I was at university and invited some friends to stay, my father would always find something to criticize, whilst Mother would succeed yet again in embarrassing me. She once asked in front of my friends if I had put on clean underclothes that day. I could laugh now, but I can assure you it was not funny at the time. And," continued Toad, "I'll tell you a story that may interest you. Once, not so long before she died, I plucked up courage and said to her, 'Mother, when will you stop treating me like a little boy?' And do you know what she said?" "I think I can guess," said Heron, "but tell me." "She said, 'I'll stop treating you like a little boy when you stop behaving like one.' There seemed to be no answer to this, so I walked out of the room." "That must have made you feel very angry," said the Heron after a pause. "Oh, no," said Toad. "I never get angry. I'm not the type." And he smiled weakly. "So how do you deal with your angry feelings?" asked Heron. Toad sat up straight and swallowed hard. What exactly do you mean by anger? "Oh, come on, Toad," said the heron impatiently. "You know what anger is. How do you deal with it? When were you last angry?" Toad was thrown into confusion. First, he hadn't been thinking about anger at that moment, and second, he found it difficult to admit to feeling angry at any time. He had always felt as if he would be punished if anyone knew he was angry. The result was that he swallowed his angry feelings and felt extremely guilty instead. But why should herons suddenly start on this particular subject? Thinking about anger made Toad feel very anxious, and he wanted to change the subject. But there was Heron looking intently at him and waiting for an answer. Toad felt he had no choice but to continue. "To be honest, I am not sure when I was last angry. Come to think of it, I rarely if ever get angry. It seems so unnecessary, and I don't think it's my style." He smiled a placatory smile. "Well," said Heron, "I think you may find it helpful if you did think about it. After all, you have already agreed that it's one of the basic emotions with which we are all born. Look at it this way, Toad. What do you think happened when you got angry as a child?" Toad considered this question and remembered his father, tall, stern, and forbidding. Behind him in the shadows, as it were, stood his grandfathers, men of character and probity, their very presence spelling out the highest standards of morality. Toad felt that their influence had dominated his life, just as their portraits dominated the library at Toad Hall. "I suppose," said Toad, "that when I remember those early days, it's my parents' anger I remember, not my own. I was always being told what to do. Father frequently got angry with me when I misbehaved." "So," said the heron, "when a child has stern and critical parents, it must learn to cope with them and adapt its natural behavior to deal best with that situation. What is such a child likely to do?" "Does this mean we're back to the adapted child state again?" asked Toad. "Precisely," answered Heron. "You will remember that, in the natural child, each of us has our basic emotions, which are comparable to the primary colours on an artist's palette. But then we must learn to adapt this natural behaviour to our particular circumstances, toning the colours down in order to survive and preserve our personal integrity. This means, amongst many other factors, learning how to cope with anger, the anger of our parents, and our own anger." He paused. "How do you feel about that, Toad?" "That's quite difficult to imagine," Toad replied thoughtfully. "I'm thinking about your idea of emotions as colours. I'm trying to imagine painting a picture which depicts the struggle between the child with its developing emotions and feelings with its parents. They have such fixed ideas about right and wrong, and are immeasurably stronger. How does any child survive this battle?" "You think that growing up must always be a battle?" asked Heron. "Well, I think it probably was in my case," Toad answered. "I think there must have been very strong pressures on me when I was little, and I had to cope with critical parents." He paused, and there was complete silence, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Then, after a while, Toad said in a small voice, "I wonder how I learned to cope with all of that." "To discover that," said the heron, "let us use our brains and be logical, and let me ask you this question. How is a person likely to respond if he is victimized and bullied by someone much stronger than himself and cannot escape?" Toad thought for a while and then said, "If such a person is really powerless, he or she must learn to go along with the oppressor. Otherwise, I suppose life would be made unbearable." "Exactly," said Heron. "So is it not likely that when you were a child, you had to learn how to comply with your parents' strict wishes and demands?" After some time, Toad agreed that this was probably the case. "So," said Heron, "what did you have to do?" Toad thought about this for some time. Within himself, he was feeling sad and unhappy as he remembered those distant times, but although their source was so far away, those memories and feelings were as alive in his consciousness as if they were happening in the present. However, another part of himself felt alert and challenged, and able to think about these matters objectively without being affected by them. "I suppose," he said slowly, "if you're forced to comply with someone, it means that you don't argue with them. You go along with what they say and agree with them." "Good," said Heron. "I'm going to write this down, because I think you're discovering something of great importance." He went to the flip chart and wrote the heading Compliant Behavior, and underneath, Agreeing. "Anything else?" he asked. Toad pondered for a while. "I think that as well as going along with my parents' wishes, I always wanted to please them. I'm not sure if I ever succeeded, but I remember clearly wanting them to be pleased and proud of me." He paused for a while, again deep in thought. "Perhaps that is why I developed a tendency to show off. They never seemed pleased or impressed with what I did, so I indulged in extravagant and stupid behavior to try and gain their attention. Is that likely, Heron?" Heron looked intensely at Toad and realized that, at that moment, Toad's voice and appearance exactly complemented his words, for he looked and sounded and clearly felt like a very sad child. This sadness affected the Heron deeply. He sat quietly and tried to share Toad's memories and to experience his sadness, in as far as one person can ever feel what another is feeling. This is called empathy. Toad felt this unspoken support and understanding, and it strengthened him to his very soul. After a while, the Heron said, "I think you are probably right, Toad," and then was quiet again as he sat beside Toad at his pool of loneliness. "Well now," said Heron after a while, when he judged the time was right, "we must press on. Earlier, you were saying that you were always wanting to please your parents. Shall I add this to our list of compliant behavior?" "Oh, yes," said Toad, his voice stronger now. "And there's another thing you can write down. Apologizing. I know I do that now, and I know I did it as a child. Almost before I had done anything, I would apologize in order to placate Father." "Why don't you write this up?" asked Heron. So for the first time, Toad took the crayon and added apologizing to the list. Then he turned to Heron and said, "You know, I'm beginning to realize this list describes not only my past but also my present. What I learned to do then is curiously close to how I behave now. I don't know if that surprises me or not." "I suppose what is surprising," answered Heron, "is to realize just how much of our adult behavior was learnt in childhood. But when you think about it, it is fairly obvious. The strongest feelings we had as children inevitably become those we regularly experience as adults. Perhaps that was what the poet meant when he wrote, 'The child is father of the man.' And I would like to add one further item to our list, if you agree." "What's that?" asked Toad. "Dependency," answered Heron. After a pause, Toad said, "I'm sure about that. I mean, aren't all children dependent on their parents? Isn't that the natural way of behaving when you are small and helpless?" "Yes, it is," answered Heron. "But for most people, the very essence of growing up is to lessen and finally break those ties of dependency and become an independent and autonomous person. Few achieve this totally, some achieve it partially, and many remain dependent all their lives." "But what has this to do with compliant behavior?" asked Toad somewhat cautiously. "What I mean," said Heron, "is that compliant behavior can result in someone learning to be dependent as a way of life. In other words, they never really grow up." "You mean like me, I suppose," said Toad, and he started to giggle. "I suppose I do," said Heron, and for the first time he too started to laugh. It was a rather dry sound, as if he did not indulge in laughter very often. But it was a genuine laugh, and it enabled Toad to turn his rather irritating giggles into proper laughter. "Sorry about that," said Toad, wiping his eyes. "We have been so serious, and suddenly it all seemed so ludicrous. I just had to laugh." "Please don't apologize," said Heron. "It's time we finished anyway, and how nice that we can do it on a happy note." This time Heron walked with Toad to the door, and as he was leaving, turned to him and said, "Toad, I believe you are making progress. There is still much to be done, but you have set your feet firmly on the path of learning, and you can never go back." And with a friendly wave, Heron shut the door. Toad walked home along the riverbank and felt happier than he had done in a very long time.